Okay, I think we're ready to get started. And I'm going to give the introduction, which is the beginning of the handout. So there's one page with the introduction and then an outline. And then there's various texts that I'm going to be referring to. And I'll tell you when we're going to read them. But if we all read it together, then you don't have to keep looking at your handout. You can keep paying attention to what I'm saying. So we'll put those down in between. Thomas Aquinas, The Art of Clear Thinking to Heal a Crazy World. There are many ways to classify original sin: pride, a lack of trust in God, disobedience. But there is another way to think about it. In Genesis 3, 1-7, Eve failed to recognize the lie that the serpent told her about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and let herself be convinced into committing sin. And so the same process continues in our world today. Am I too close? Where evil is often misidentified as good and vice versa, truth as lies. The result leaves many people wounded, and confusion and contradictions are rampant. Even though sin is technically in the will, it is the intellect that presents things to the will, and thus it is important that the intellect gets it right. Demasking lies and being educated in the truth, then, is a significant step in converting our minds, as St. Paul says in Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Converting our thinking to Christ goes far beyond avoiding sin, but about penetrating the depths of the mystery of God. Today we gather to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the intellectual giants of the Catholic Church, one who devoted his life to the contemplation of the truth. Thomas had a brilliant mind and a strong charism, not only of separating truth from lies, but of describing reality, both natural and supernatural. Fortunately for us, he left behind a huge body of philosophical and theological writings so that we can learn from him. We could spend a lifetime studying the most essential truths of God and man, according to Aquinas. However, tonight we will set a modest goal: to follow in his footsteps, to try to become clearer thinkers in our own lives, facing the problems that are ours, using Thomas as a model, so that we can make a step in converting our minds to Christ. We will look at his personal life and his approach to philosophy and theology to see how to develop into a stronger thinker. In addition, various contradictions of our modern world and church, for which St. Thomas offers a remedy, will be highlighted. We will finish up by looking at modern Thomism and how Aquinas continues to bear fruit in the intellectual life of the church. And conscious that there's a variety of academic levels and languages here, I'm going to try to give something for everybody. So there may be, at certain points, technical language that is not used, and that's on purpose. So those of you who know the technical language, you can fill in the gaps. So as a starting point, we're going to turn to a speech that Pope Francis gave in January, on January 12th, to a group of students. So that's on your handout, turn the page, and it's text number 1. And in addressing these students, he wrote about weak thinking and strong thinking. And so this is his message that he wants to give to young people, and I think it introduces what Thomas has to say. Today, instead, what some call short-term thinking seems to be spreading. Short-term thinking, they call it, a thought made up of a few characters that burns out immediately. A thought that does not look upwards and ahead, but at the here and now. Just the here and now, the fruit of the needs of the moment. A thought that does not look back to history, that does not contain a historical legacy. A thought that moves by instinct and is measured in instants. That, made up of emotions and compressed into few words, seems to substitute the already weak thought of postmodernism. And this is the drama of postmodernism, weak thought. In the face of the complexity of life and the world, This brief thought leads us to generalize and criticize, to simplify and retouch reality in the pursuit of one's own immediate interests rather than the good of others and of the future of everyone. So I think that's a very good description of weak thought. Unfortunately, Pope Francis then, he goes on to talk about inviting the young people to be committed in their lives. So he doesn't give a good definition of what strong thinking is, but fortunately we can guess what the opposite of those things are, and we can find them in Thomas Aquinas. So I'm going to go through some different points. So what we see here is short-term thinking. It's very recognizable in our society today. With social media, Twitter or X, you have to reduce it to, I don't know how many characters right now, but not very many. There's YouTube shorts, Facebook shorts, all this media generation, clickbait in the news, where it's all trying to catch attention for one sentence and to gain popularity through that sentence or through that image. And that does not produce strong thinking, the ability to really explain an idea, to go into the depths of contemplating God, as Dr. Dolna was describing, that St. Thomas Aquinas does. So guessing the opposite, we can say that strong thinking looks up into the future, looks beyond the here and now. It cultivates awe, wonder of the world. It cultivates contemplation of its creator, its people, and its creatures, and it builds on a legacy. Thomas Aquinas' life is a crossroads of many historical events or currents. He was born in a time of scholasticism, and where there's a heavy emphasis on logic and the writings of the early church fathers. In the 12th century, the University of Paris had been founded, and in the method of teaching, they used debates and dialectic to unveil true opinions. He was born at a time when the translations of Aristotle were being made, and as we'll see, Aristotle is a big part of the tradition and his legacy that he leaves behind, but is also a big debate in the church at the time. He was also born just after the birth of the Dominicans, and so the Dominicans were the new thing of his time period. Because he was born into a noble family, he was caught in the tension between the church and the state. There was the Emperor Frederick II was waging war against the Pope, and his family, as a noble family, was trying to remain faithful to the emperor, and little Thomas wanted to enter the Dominicans, which was fighting for the Pope, which resulted in him being put in prison for a year by his family. He was kidnapped. He entered the Dominicans, and he was immediately sent to Rome by the Dominicans to protect him, and he was kidnapped along the way by his family and put in prison for a year before he was allowed to go pursue his path with the Dominicans. Amidst all of the drama of his life, Thomas remained faithful to his vocation to contemplate truth, and that's why he followed the Dominican path rather than the Benedictine life that had been laid out for him by his family. One of the most important things about Thomas is that he was a man of prayer. For him, theology and thinking go together. It's important not to lose sight of prayer and the love of God in the pursuit of truth. And this is one of the contradictions that we can see in theology, is that it's a challenge to pursue truth in a way that is at the service of love of God and love of neighbor. So what is truth, according to Thomas? If he spent his life devoted to the contemplation of the truth, what is the truth that he contemplated? And so we can turn to text number 2, or it might be number 3. It's the Summa, question 16. The truth of our intellect is according to its conformity with its principle, that is to say, to the things from which it receives knowledge. The truth also of things is according to their conformity with their principle, namely the divine intellect. If you have to read that twice or 3 times to get it, that's normal. But one of the things that Thomas is doing here is he's situating, there's different concepts. There's truth, there's God, there's the intellect, and there's also being. And the question is, how does this all fit together? And for me, this is one of the big geniuses of Thomas, is no matter what topic he is talking about, he lays out what are the concepts at stake, what causes what receives what, and how does it all relate together. What he gives is a description of reality. And so this is something that we can really take from him in our understanding of the world, or from Thomistic thinking, is whatever our object of contemplation is, whatever problem we're trying to solve, whatever thing we're trying to understand, whether it's a virtue, a sin, the Trinity, postmodernism, is we lay out the different concepts at stake, and then we try to make the connections. How do they relate to each other? What causes what, and what leads to what? And this is part of this aspect of taking a thought outside of the context of just the here and now. It comes from somewhere and it goes somewhere. So for Thomas, what he says in this question 16 of the Summa, which is the question about truth, is he's saying that there's God, and in God there is eternal truth. So all of truth is within God, and it's eternal. Then we have things here, like we have some flowers. So God created the flowers. And then we have my mind, or your minds. And truth is in my mind as much as I know these flowers. So as much as what I see and can understand about these flowers is going to be true, but it's in my mind. It's not in the flower. But the thing is, the reference for the flower is God. God created the flower, and God knows this flower perfectly. And that's a piece that's very important in our world today. Because if it's only about me and the flower, then I can decide to change things another way. But the direction that Thomas gives to truth is that God gives being to the flower, and then I have to conform my mind to this reality that is the flower. I receive it, and through that I have contact with God. So we can see that this understanding of truth is very essential to Thomas's thinking, also in his development on faith and reason. Because there's another way, I can receive things directly from God, or I can receive them through created things. This gives us the challenge to conform what's in our minds to the reality of the world and to the divine reality. And this is our task in theology. This is our task in learning. Whether we're learning science or history or biology or theology, that we conform what's in our mind to the reality as God created it. Our next text is from the Catechism, number 27. The desire for God is written in the human heart, because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. The intellect is made for truth and for this contemplation of God. And knowledge without God is missing a part of happiness. And it's good that we keep that in mind. This is something that we can take from Aquinas, is that this, whatever truth there is, there's a bigger reality, which is God, behind that truth. And ultimately, we're made for the contemplation of truth. And so that is ultimately what satisfies us. It's what brings happiness. In Thomas's method of contemplating truth, his writings are spiritually nourishing because of this divine reality that's behind his approach to truth. And he's aware that the desire for God is written in the human heart, that the intellect is intellectually nourished by this search for truth. In many ways, Thomas's writings can be healing for a world that tends towards superficiality, or even a church that often seems shaken by scandal and the number of people leaving. Our souls are longing for the contact with the depths of God, man, and how to have a good life. The next point that we can learn from St. Thomas is to ask good questions, ones that look upward and beyond. Good academics ask questions to cultivate intellectual curiosity. Anyone who's ever had to write a paper knows that the most essential part is you need to ask a good question, something that you want to know the answer to or is worth knowing the answer to. And that is what stimulates all the rest. And that every paper should be answering a question. If it's just talking, then you probably should start over. Good questions can tickle our intellect and stimulate our desire to know, being a great help in pursuing truth. And like Pope Francis suggested, strong thinkers cultivate questions that look upward and beyond. So that's something we can be asking ourselves. What sort of questions do I have that I'm looking for the answers for? And we could do a search history in our internet browser, and we could probably find a lot of those questions. But we'll leave that in the silence of your brains and in your hearts. However, Thomas had a very interesting question, and all of his biographers note that when he was a child, he asked his teachers, "What is God?" when he was like 6. And I am just amazed at this question because I would have asked, "Who is God? I want to know him." But that's not what Thomas asked. He asked, "What is God?" And this question is very pertinent to what Thomas spent the rest of his life doing. The whatness of something is the question of essence. What is the essence of God? And for those of you who've read the Summa, or the Summa Theologiae, or the Summa Contra Gentiles, that this is the whole beginning part of those two works, is trying to answer the question of what is God? And it's the part of natural theology. How can we define God? What is God as a being? And it's not even talking about revelation yet, but just intellectually, what is God? And ironically, Thomas comes to the answer, the conclusion that is not a conclusion, is that you can't define the essence of God because God is existence. It's it's like the Exodus answer, God is what is. It's an answer without being an answer. But his essence is his existence. At the same time, he does put a lot of words on the paper to try to answer the question, and he comes up with the divine attributes. So he has his existence, his simplicity, his perfection, goodness, infinity, omnipresence, immutability, eternity, one, etc. He doesn't get to the person's question until question 29 or 33 in the Summa. For me, the person question is, who is God? The question I would have asked, but then we're two different people with two different calls. The questions that we have are part of what moves us forward in our vocation and can be what feeds our contribution to the church and to the world today. Part of what fascinates us as we look around and we study the culture around us, when we study theology, what are the questions that are moving our hearts, that are tickling our brains? And these are the questions that we can dive into to try to find answers and make a contribution. And obviously, as Pope Francis said, our questions should be upward. So obviously there are a lot of downward questions that are important to keep functioning in this world. We have to know what time the train comes. We have to know what's happening. But upward questions are important to bring us to God. They lift up our minds to something more than just this earthly reality. And if we read the Summa, which is in question format, we have a whole series of questions that we can look at, these upward questions of understanding who God is, understanding the sacraments, the incarnation, the redemption. And you can just go and look up the question and find Thomas's version of the answer. The next point is building on a historical legacy and contributing to it. Thomas not only sought to be part of the tradition, but he brings us with him in citing so many sources. It makes you want to read other related questions or go back to previous questions. Reading Thomas draws you into a debate where some of the objections can seem right until you read why they're false. Thomas has an amazing knowledge of the Bible, probably in large part from his upbringing at Monte Cassino. How many children were raised with the divine office? But he had the providential luck of being raised in a Benedictine monastery where he heard the Bible and the liturgy, and so he had very good knowledge of it. An Aquinas biographer, Donald Prudlow, estimates that there are 48,000 references in his works. 48,000. I don't know if you can picture how many footnotes you put in your last paper, but to think about that and to reach the number of 48,000 is pretty impressive. This means that he's engaging a lot of sources. He's building on an intellectual tradition. And this is on one hand the biblical tradition, it's also the church fathers and those who went before him. But it is also a secular tradition, and he's reading Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides. He's engaging, and there's whole questions of the Summa where he speaks about Plato before getting on to Aristotle. So he's very well read, and what he's doing with each one of these sources is he compares them to try to find what's true and what's to throw away or not to include. He's engaging their thought. So we can turn to text number 4. This is still question 16 of the Summa about truth. Consequently, there are various definitions of truth. Augustine says, "Truth is that whereby is made manifest that which is." And Hilary says, "The truth makes being clear and evident, and this pertains to truth according as it is in the intellect. As to the truth of things, insofar as they are related to the intellect, we have Augustine's definition. Truth is supreme likeness without any unlikeness to a principle." Also, Anselm's definition, truth is rightness, perceptible by the mind alone, for that is right, which is in accordance with the principle. Also, Avicenna's definition, the truth of each thing is a property of the essence, which is immutably attached to it. The definition that truth is the equation of thought and thing is applicable to it under either aspect. So it's not so important to distinguish all of those definitions of truth. You can do that at home if you'd like. But what I think is interesting about this passage is it's the first article about truth. So there's a whole set of articles, and it's at the end of his Respondeo, where he's showing that he looks at all the other best definitions that he could find about truth before he answers his version, his position, what is truth. And this is something that is very important. It makes me think of what they told us before starting our doctorates, was that you have to read everything there is about the topic that you want. Then you have to find a gap somewhere. And then you have to try to fill that gap with what your idea is. So this is sort of his step of field research. What has already been said about truth? How do we put that together and categorize it? And then which of these am I going to say, this is what I agree with? This is my position. And this is something that it's building our thought on the past, on a lot of other people who've done a lot of work to get to their definition. And so this, again, frees us from superficiality, but it builds on a legacy. And then it's a call to contribute something by what we say. Do we have something, or do we just agree with somebody else? And maybe that's what our position should be. Actually, Augustine had the best definition. That's what I agree with. Let's move on. There's nothing new to add. But if there is something to add, then I'm adding something that isn't just a product of my own brain. It has already been thought about and worked on. It's sort of the opposite of a tweet. Although maybe a lot of people work on those too, I don't know. Another point to bring up, perhaps, of building on a tradition is that he's very respectful of his opponents. He does not trash them. He does not make their arguments seem ridiculous, but he presents them in a way that is honorable to those who've gone before him. And even those whom he thinks are wrong, he says it in a respectful way. And I think that this is a very important point for our world today, is respect towards other people's thoughts. And yes, in a culture where people are canceled, etc., the respect for our opponent's thought and to be charitable in how we approach, how we treat others who are in the debate. The next point is, good thinking looks beyond the here and now, is oriented toward an end. So this was sort of mentioned already, but for Aquinas, final causality is very important. Final causality is the end. It's the reason why I'm thinking something. It's the reason why I'm doing something. And it's the end, it's the goal that puts everything else into movement, into action. And so good thinking is looking beyond the problem of right now, but it has an eye on the final end, the final goal. There's a claim that can be made that this is why the Summa starts with a question about God and this idea of what is God, the divine attributes, because this is the God that we're going to meet at the end of our lives. It's good to have thought about it before. And our souls are immortal. And what is our soul, according to Thomas, but our intellect and our will? And so our souls are going with us when we die, hopefully to heaven. And so it's hopefully we've developed our intellect and our will, and we've worked on it a bit to have thought about important things, to have developed our intellect in a way that's ready for heaven, that's thought about important things, that's thought about what that end is. Who is God? What is God? What is charity? What does it mean to love? Our next point is commitment to growth as a thinker. One of the contradictions of our world today is that we can master anything with a phone. This is how I fix anything that's broken. There's a drain that's plugged. Let me go on YouTube and watch a video about it. I can learn anything, master anything with the wonderful help of the internet. And that in our world we can master things quickly that are superficial. We can look up Wikipedia. We can look up whatever source that's a little more sophisticated than Wikipedia, like this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something like that. But we can master things with the internet. But that's different than growing in our capacity to think and growing in this depth and understanding of the reality of the world and of God. Anybody who's read any bit of Thomas knows that it's hard. It takes a lot of dedication to go through Thomas's works. And if you wanted to do it right, you could also read those 48,000 references that he quotes, and not just through Thomas, but go back to the original sources as a good academic and consult those 48,000 quotes themselves and to see what context they're in. All of that is a bit overwhelming and maybe too much for us. But when we look at Thomas's life, it gives us some insight about how to do this. And I read a biography from Jean-Pierre Torel. It's called Initiation to Thomas Aquinas. And he's a Dominican in Fribourg, so he's an elderly man now, but he devoted his life to the study of Thomas Aquinas. And so one of the things he did was he outlined what Thomas did every year of his academic life. And it's super interesting to see, but it sort of demystified Thomas. Thomas can seem just overwhelming in how much writing he did and how difficult his writing can be when you're getting started. But in reading that, I saw that actually Thomas had to teach a class on Pauline literature at the university. And so what did he do? He wrote a commentary on Corinthians during that time. He had to teach a class on angels or spiritual substances. And so all of his work on the soul and immaterial substances was in a certain period of his life. He wrote his commentary on De Anima during that time. And you could see his life in terms of blocks, where he turned his attention to a certain subject because he had to teach a class on it, or maybe because he had an idea that he wanted to write out. But that if you think, okay, well, this year I'm going to be studying the soul, for example, or eschatology. I'm going to be studying eschatology this year. And at the end of the year, I'm going to write a little summary or try to contribute something. Maybe I'll write an article to try to publish an article at the end of this year about that topic. Or maybe I just want to know for myself, and I'll just have a little file of notes. But that means that this year, that's my goal. And over time, that grows into becoming a stronger thinker. And to see this growth, that happens step by step. But it takes commitment to actually to be doing this for our whole lifetime. And we don't want to be one of those people who become stagnant and keep repeating the same thing. I suddenly looked over at the priest because it can be for homilies, but I was thinking, I mean, we've all had the priest who repeats the same homily, but I have no condemnation because it's hard. For teaching, it's the same thing. You don't want to just get stuck in a rut doing the same things that you always thought. But you don't want to abandon things that are true. And the resolution for this problem, the solution for this problem, is to continue growing and engaging new sources, engaging new ideas, or applying those same ideas to new scenarios in the world. Next, we have clarity of ideas and expression. And with this, I thought immediately of Father Borchardt, who's not here tonight, so I can talk about him. No, I would say it even if he was here. But one of my memories of moral theology here is we'd always have to summarize an article of Aquinas on moral theology, and whenever the person talking started to talk for a long time, he would sort of make a joke or a comment that wasn't quite a joke, that the point of a summary is not supposed to be longer than the actual text. And the thing is, this can be a bigger challenge than it seems, because Thomas is so clear and succinct that it's hard to summarize him. He has a very neat little syllogistic argument, duk, 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 that if you try to put other words on it, suddenly he just wrote a page trying to say what he said in a paragraph. And Aquinas is a strong defender of the simplicity of God, that God is simple with no parts, and that the higher angelic intellects reflect this simplicity. They're simpler than our intellects. And so he has this hierarchy of intelligence that your thought should become simpler rather than more complicated. Obviously, there's a lot of nuances on this, but just to give the idea that when we really know something, we can say it clear and with less words. A counter argument to this would be Augustine, who probably is a rival to Aquinas in the number of pages written, but with a lot more words and a lot less clarity. He says really important things, but in a stylistically different way. So it's not the kind of the bullet point form that we have with Aquinas. But this level of clarity is what makes Aquinas so attractive to read as well, because there's times when, I know there's people here who are in the class about City of God. It's a really long book by Augustine, and after you're reading City of God, it's over 1,000 pages, and then you go back and you just read 2 pages of Thomas where you go right to the heart, and you think, whew, thank God that there is Thomas in the church, that there is a place in the church for clear, succinct thinking where you get right to the point. And so this provides for us a model of what are we striving for. Clarity is important when we're looking at the confusion of our world. And this is what we see with a lot of what's happening in the culture is there's a lot of good things mixed with bad things. And this clarity of mind can help pierce through all of these things to separate. Okay, yeah, that's good. That's why people like this. But no, that's false. That we need to denounce, or we need to say that that's false. And so clarity is, it's restful to the soul and to the mind. It's a bit like a sketch when you're drawing, that when you draw and you're not that good yet, you sketch and you have lines that are sort of like this, and there's a lot of gray, and it looks really real because you haven't committed to a firm line. But when you commit to a firm line, like if you're drawing a human body, and then you see, oh, that knee doesn't look like a knee at all. But if you sketch it out, it still looks pretty knee-ish. And this is the image that I had of clarity, the clarity of Thomas. So striving for that. I have a little anecdote of Thomas that I wanted to include in this. So this is the next point. Using wisdom to find the suitable means to achieve the desired end, not getting lost along the way. And in 1252, Aquinas was sent back to Paris. He'd been in Cologne with Albert the Great, and then he was sent back to Paris. And this was a very tumultuous time in Paris. It was the time of the Averroes controversy, and it was also a time between the disputes between the masters of the university that were not Dominicans or Franciscan, and then the Franciscans or the Mendicant orders. And so the university professors that were not Mendicant brothers were trying to get rid of them because they didn't want them taking up the professorship spots. Anyway, this was a very heated environment to the point that people were being killed about this. I was reading in a biography that there was a bar fight. There was the university strike, and then there was a bar fight where they started, I don't know, throwing chairs or something. I don't know exactly how it went down. All about these tensions. So obviously Thomas was not at the bar fight. I would guess not. He's probably home writing at his desk as a good student. But what's interesting to see with this is that, and this is what the biographer was saying, was that he seems to be one of the few, even Dominicans, who was fruitful at this time, writing things. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought immediately of COVID. You know, COVID was a hard time the whole world went through, and some people were super productive and others not at all. But that how to find the suitable means and not get lost along the way. That in the intellectual life, so Thomas, in this time period, he wrote the defense of the Mendicant orders. That was his answer. It wasn't going to a bar to throw punches. He wrote a very excellent defense of the Mendicant orders, which is quite long, actually. And so he's fighting for his cause, which is the truth and the defense of his way of life, but he finds the way that's suitable for him and that's going to bear fruit. So now we're going to turn to Thomistic thinking today in the modern world. Thomism is the descendants of Thomas's thinking, and there's a wonderful article written by Thomas White, who's the head of the Angelicum right now, and it's called Thomism After Vatican II, for anyone who's interested in reading that. But he contrasts two different thinkers, two different Thomists, and so you can turn to text number 5. It's our last text. So the first one that he presents is Cornelius Fabro, who is an Italian priest, and he says, he foretold that this cultural tendency, and he's talking about of postmodern subjectivism, would lead to a twofold error. On the one hand, an extreme form of skeptical rationalism that takes any appeal to absolute truth claims derived from divine revelation to be an imposition upon the freedom of human consciousness to derive for itself the content of personal truth claims. In effect, the rise of extreme versions of private truth theories. On the other hand, what he termed an extreme fideism, a theology that takes refuge in the integrity of traditional forms of thought without due reference to metaphysical realism, the philosophical study of nature, ethical objectivity, or a healthy confidence in the positive relation between supernatural faith and natural science. What Thomas White was identifying, or that Fabro represents, is a school of Thomism, or a tendency of Thomism, to look at the principles like metaphysical, his metaphysical positions. Let's see, the list was there. Metaphysical realism, the philosophical study of nature, ethical objectivity, or you could say virtue ethics, the healthy confidence in the positive relationship between supernatural faith and science. So faith and reason. There's lots of positions that are Thomist because that's exactly what Thomas says. And I hope that, I personally think, and I hope that I communicated that Thomas positions themselves have a lot to bring to the world and the church today. There's a lot of things that he says that help reveal the lies or the untruths or the half-truths that we find in our world today. But that's one tendency of Thomism, is to use its principles. But there's a criticism of that type of Thomism, which is it's boring. It uses old language. The caricature that it's an old manual that you have to memorize. And a lot of people that grew up with that revolt against that. So what we have is another school of Thomism, which was represented by Yves Congar, and there's no quote for it, but it's a missionary Thomism, using Thomas's intellectual commitment to engage the world's problems. And what he lays out is that Thomas had his problems in his day. Faith and reason was one of the major issues of his day, was integrating, Aristotle was coming to conclusions that were contrary to faith. And already in Islam had rejected philosophy because it came to the conclusion that were against Islam. And the Catholic Church, they were what are they called? Condemnations. I found it on my paper. There were condemnations, and at the universities, there was a lot of hesitancy whether Aristotle could be read and studied at these universities during this time period, because would he lead to everyone losing their faith? And so what Thomas did was he reworked Aristotle in order to baptize him, to distinguish what was true from Aristotle, what was in coherence with revelation, and what was false. And Thomas did this with great enthusiasm and passion for the problems of his time. And what Yves Congar is promoting is a type of Thomism that takes the same intellectual rigor, but looks at today's problems. Not the problem of the unity of the intellect, or the one universal intellect that was a huge debate in his time. That's no longer the big debate. But what are some of the big debates of our time? We could make a list, but postmodern subjectivism, atheism, the whole climate of excluding God from politics, from universities, from culture, etc., gender, sexuality, ecology. There are a lot of topics that can be engaged. And to conclude, because time's up, like Thomas White, this is Thomas White's conclusion of these two versions of Thomism, and he says both have their place. So it leaves room for each one of us to say, where's my place in theology? Is it to study specifically the principles of Thomas, or is it to use his intellectual rigor to engage the problems, or to do both? And I would say that it's great to try for a merging of the two, but I would like to propose that St. Thomas's thought has something to contribute to the church and the world today. He's helpful in developing our own contemplation of truth, and because God is infinite, there's always more to know about him. Thomas is a good teacher of the Catholic faith and gives the tools to think clearly about God and the world around us. Western culture is losing faith. Mainstream intellectual and cultural environments ignore God in their endeavors, and there is increasing pressure to impose this worldview on everyone. Aquinas gives the philosophical and theological tools to see the world rightly in light of the gospel. He equips us with principles that help distinguish truth from lies. Although it is very useful to study Thomas's thought, it is important that it doesn't stay in the past, but like Yves Congar said, that we bring into today's problems. Ideas eventually work their way into the choices that people make, the things that they love and that they pursue, and a whole lifestyle that embraces core values. Let us not underestimate the truth. The intellect longs for it, rejoices when it finds it, and suffers when it's caught in lies. We cannot heal the world from all of its lies and sins, but we can cultivate truth in our life.